The world didn't just shift, it cracked. Right now, as you're watching this, the United States is engaged in an active war with Iran, and the diplomatic story coming out of Washington and the diplomatic story coming out of Tehran are so wildly different that they cannot both be true. And that gap, that chasm between two completely contradictory narratives is exactly where you need to focus your attention, because that is where the real picture lives. Donald Trump announced a 5-day pause on military strikes against Iran, describing it as the product of very good and productive talks between U.S. and Iranian delegations. Iran, within hours of that announcement, categorically denied that any negotiations were taking place at all. Not a partial denial, not a nuanced diplomatic pushback, a flat, categorical, institutional rejection. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi went on CBS News and said his nation never asked for a ceasefire, and we have never asked even for negotiation. And yet here is Trump standing in front of cameras telling the American people that Iran wants to make a deal. Someone is not telling the truth. And in geopolitics, when two sides tell completely opposite stories about the same moment in time, it is almost never an accident. It is strategy. Both sides are speaking to their own domestic audiences. Both sides are constructing a narrative that serves their internal political needs. And you, sitting in America trying to make sense of what is happening to your world, to your gas prices, to your economy, to global stability, you are caught in the middle of that information war. So let's cut through it together, because this story is much bigger and much more consequential than most people realize. Now let's go back to the beginning of how we got here, because context is everything. U.S. and Israeli military operations against Iran began in February 2026, and since March 4th, Iranian forces declared the Strait of Hormuz officially closed, threatening and carrying out attacks on ships attempting to transit it. That single sentence should stop you cold, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another body of water on a map. It is the jugular vein of the global economy. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, forming a seaway passage between Iran and Oman, and its two unidirectional sea lanes facilitate the transit of around 20 million barrels of oil per day, representing roughly 20% of global seaborne oil trade. 20%. Think about that. 1/5 of all the oil that moves by sea on this planet flows through a passage so narrow that at its tightest point you could almost throw a stone across it, and Iran sits right on top of it. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz disrupted 20% of global oil supplies and significant liquefied natural gas volumes. The head of the International Energy Agency described the situation as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not a pundit saying that. That is the International Energy Agency, the organization created after the 1973 oil crisis specifically to manage exactly this kind of emergency, saying that what is happening right now is the worst energy security crisis in recorded history. Let that land, the worst, not one of the worst ever, and the numbers back that up completely. Brent crude oil prices surpassed $100 per barrel on March 8, 2026, for the first time in 4 years, rising to $126 per barrel at its peak. The closure of the strait has been described as the largest disruption to the energy supply since the 1970s energy crisis. And what does that mean for ordinary Americans? Gasoline prices in the U.S. rose 7.5% to $3.20 per gallon initially, then surged above $4 per gallon, the highest since late 2023. California's gasoline prices surged above $5 per gallon during the second week of March 2026. So while Washington is arguing about who said what, real Americans are standing at real gas pumps watching real numbers climb. This is not an abstract geopolitical debate. This is your household budget. This is your commute to work. This is the price of every single product that gets shipped by truck, which is to say nearly everything you buy. Now let's talk about what Iran is actually saying and why their position is far more coherent and strategically logical than the Western press is giving them credit for. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi made Iran's position crystal clear. This war is not our war. We did not start it. The United States started it and is responsible for all the consequences of this war, human and financial. whether for Iran, for the region, or for the entire world. Now, whether you agree with Iran's position or not, you have to recognize that this is a principled strategic stance. Iran is not saying they want to fight forever. They're saying something much more interesting. Araghchi said, "We are not seeking a ceasefire because we do not want this scenario to be repeated again after some time. Rather, we want the war to end completely and permanently." Read that again carefully. Iran is not rejecting peace. Iran is rejecting a temporary pause that leaves the underlying conditions of conflict intact. They've watched what happened in Gaza. They've watched what happened in Lebanon. They've watched ceasefires get announced, then violated, then re-announced, and they've concluded that a 5-day pause followed by resumed bombardment is not a diplomatic process. It is a tactical reset dressed in diplomatic language. Iran's foreign ministry accused Trump of attempting to buy time while regional de-escalation efforts continue independently of U.S. involvement. And look, maybe that accusation is unfair. Maybe Trump genuinely believes a 5-day window creates real space for diplomacy. But Iran's skepticism is not paranoia. It is grounded in decades of experience with American foreign policy in the region. You don't have to accept every Iranian framing to acknowledge that their suspicion of short-term American gestures has a very long and very well-documented historical basis. Iran described the pause in strikes as a retreat under pressure, not a diplomatic initiative. And this is where it gets truly interesting from a strategic analysis perspective. Iran has been enormously effective economically, and that economic effectiveness is arguably their most powerful weapon. Think about what they've actually managed to do. They have a military that cannot match the United States or Israel in a direct conventional confrontation. Everyone knows this. Trump said it openly. Trump told reporters they don't have a Navy, they don't have an Air Force, they don't have any equipment. And in purely conventional military terms, that is largely accurate. Iran cannot win a traditional war against the U.S.-Israel combination. So they're not fighting a traditional war. They are fighting a geoeconomic war. And in that war, they are doing something remarkable. Iran, unable to match the U.S. and Israel militarily, is internationalizing the costs of war by targeting energy, shipping, commercial, and civilian infrastructure across the Gulf. The logic is simple. Raise the price of escalation until pressure for de-escalation builds. That is not a desperate strategy. That is a sophisticated one. Iran is not trying to defeat the United States military. Iran is trying to make the cost of continuing this war so economically unbearable that the political will to continue it collapses, not in Tehran, but in Washington and among America's allies. And the evidence suggests it is working, at least partially. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas concluded that a closure of the Strait of Hormuz that removes close to 20% of global oil supplies from the market is expected to raise the average WTI price of oil to $98 per barrel and lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points. A 2.9 percentage point reduction in global GDP growth in a single quarter. That is the kind of economic shock that ends political careers. That is the kind of economic shock that turns a president's approval ratings upside down. That is the kind of pressure that makes even the most hawkish administration start quietly looking for an exit. And look at what happened to America's allies. Trump requested about 7 countries send warships to keep the Strait of Hormuz open and was met with resistance. Trump said, "I think NATO is making a very foolish mistake," denouncing the reluctance from other countries to get involved. 7 countries, and not one said yes. Not a single NATO ally was willing to send warships into the Strait of Hormuz to back up the American operation. Think about what that tells you about the real state of the Western alliance right now. These are countries that publicly support U.S. policy toward Iran in principle. But when it came to actually putting their ships in the water, ships that could be sunk by Iranian missiles, the answer was no, because they're looking at the same economic numbers you're looking at, and they're calculating that their own domestic situations cannot absorb any more pressure. The U.S. has imposed enormous costs on many of the same economies it relies on as trading and strategic partners. The damage to allied economies will complicate the coalition politics that will likely be needed for post-conflict stabilization. This is the hidden crisis inside the visible crisis. America has created a military situation that its own allies will not support, and the economic fallout from that situation is hammering those same allies. The World Economic Forum is basically saying that the United States has managed to simultaneously alienate its military partners and damage their economies. That is a diplomatic and strategic outcome that is very difficult to walk back. Now let's talk about what this ceasefire announcement, the 5-day pause, actually represents in real terms. While the U.S. has presented the pause as a diplomatic opening, Iran has rejected the premise of negotiations altogether, signaling that mistrust between the two sides remains deep. The divergence comes at a time when tensions in West Asia are already impacting global energy markets and supply chains. So what you have is a unilateral American decision to temporarily halt strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure, which Trump is framing as a mutual diplomatic process, while Iran is framing as a forced retreat. The truth, as usual, probably contains elements of both. Militaries pause for many reasons. They need to assess damage, they need to resupply, they need to give diplomacy a window, they need to respond to pressure from allies. Calling it a 5-day ceasefire because of productive talks is a particular framing of a much more complex operational reality. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps made their position unmistakably clear. You will not be able to artificially lower the price of oil. Expect oil at $200 per barrel. The price of oil depends on regional security, and you are the main source of insecurity in the region. That is not the language of an institution that believes it is losing. Whether or not Iran can actually sustain that kind of economic pressure indefinitely is a different question. But the posture here is one of absolute confidence in their leverage. And that leverage is real because the Strait of Hormuz gives Iran something almost no other country on earth possesses, a geographic choke point that can effectively hold the global economy hostage. They don't have to defeat the U.S. Navy. They just have to make the strait too dangerous and too expensive for commercial shipping to use. Hundreds of tankers sit idle on both sides of the Strait of Hormuz as Iran has effectively closed the waterway. The IEA released 400 million barrels of oil from emergency reserves, but experts noted this would cover only about 4 days of global consumption, or about 20 days of typical strait flows. 4 days. 4 days of consumption from what was presented as a major strategic intervention by the International Energy Agency. That tells you the scale of the problem. Strategic reserves were designed for supply disruptions of days or weeks. They were not designed for a sustained closure of the world's most critical oil shipping lane that continues indefinitely. The math simply does not work in America's favor if this drags on for months. And the human and food dimension of this crisis is something the mainstream media is almost entirely ignoring. The maritime blockade triggered a grocery supply emergency across Gulf Cooperation Council states, which rely on the strait for over 80% of their caloric intake. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted, forcing retailers to airlift staple goods, airlifting food in the 21st century, into wealthy Gulf states because no ships can get through the strait. That is the real human cost of what is happening in that narrow passage of water, and it is a cost that will continue compounding every single day this conflict continues without genuine resolution. The Pentagon estimated the Iran war would be over in 4 to 6 weeks, with Kevin Hassett, head of the National Economic Council, saying, "We expect that the global economy is going to have a big positive shock as soon as this is over." 4 to 6 weeks. That was the Pentagon's estimate. But here we are. Nearly 3 weeks into this conflict, with Iran showing absolutely no signs of collapse, the strait still functionally closed, oil prices still dangerously elevated, NATO allies still refusing to send warships, and the two sides unable to even agree on whether any diplomatic conversations are happening at all. The gap between the 4 to 6 week confident optimism and the actual reality on the ground is itself a story. Military campaigns in the Middle East have a long and painful history of lasting much longer and costing much more than the confident initial projections suggested. What begins as a battlefield shock hardens into a geoeconomic one. Historically, every major oil shock has generated a policy response proportional to the pain it inflicts. That is precisely what you are watching in real time. The pain is accumulating. It is accumulating in American gas prices. It is accumulating in global food supply chains. It is accumulating in the damaged economies of American allies who are quietly furious about being put in this position. And it is accumulating in the political calculus of an American administration that came into office promising economic prosperity and is now presiding over oil prices that haven't been this high in years. The question everyone needs to be sitting with, the question that actually matters for where this goes next, is very simple. What does resolution look like? Because the two sides are not just disagreeing about tactics. They are disagreeing about fundamental reality. Trump says Iran wants to make a deal. Iran says it has never asked for a deal. Trump says the ceasefire reflects productive talks. Iran says there are no talks and the pause reflects American retreat. Iran's Ibrahim Rezaieh said, "The battle continues and another defeat for the devil. Trump and the United States have once again been defeated." When your potential negotiating partner is publicly describing your ceasefire announcement as evidence of your defeat, you do not have a diplomatic process. You have two monologues happening simultaneously on different stages for different audiences. This is the deeper truth that the breaking news cycle keeps burying. The information environment around this war is as much a battlefield as the Strait of Hormuz itself. Every statement from Washington is calibrated for the American domestic audience. Every statement from Tehran is calibrated for the Iranian domestic audience and for the broader Muslim world and global South. The 5-day ceasefire announcement, whatever its operational military logic, is also a political product designed to give Trump a diplomatic-sounding storyline ahead of whatever comes next. And Iran's immediate rejection of that framing is equally strategic. It denies Trump the ability to claim diplomatic credit for a pause that Iran intends to characterize as a military and political victory for their side. What you are watching is not simply a military confrontation between America and Iran. You are watching a fundamental test of American power in the 21st century. Can the United States project military force in the Middle East and achieve its stated objectives without destroying its own economic foundations in the process? Can it maintain allied support for an operation that its allies' economies are paying for through higher energy costs? Can it achieve a quick resolution against an adversary that has no conventional military parity, but has something potentially more valuable, a geographic trump card that can strangle the global economy? These are the questions that this conflict is answering in real time, and the answers so far are not simple or comfortable, no matter which side of the political aisle you're sitting on. The 5-day window closes soon, and what happens when it closes is what everyone in Washington and Tehran and Beijing and Brussels, in every capital that depends on energy flowing through that narrow strait, is watching for. Because either genuine talks begin or the strikes resume, and the next chapter of this story becomes the chapter that historians will study for decades. Stay clear-eyed, stay skeptical of both narratives, and above all, watch what they do, not what they say.